Here is a compelling, narrative-driven exploration of Socrates' life. The gadfly of Athens, a life that defined the Western mind. Imagine a man walking through the crowded, sun-drenched markets of Athens. He is middle-aged, barefoot, and dressed in a simple, worn-out tunic. He has a snub nose, bulging eyes, and the physique of a soldier, but he carries no weapon. He does not seek fame, wealth, or political power. Instead, he stops the most powerful generals, the wealthiest merchants, and the most celebrated poets to ask them a single, devastating question. What is virtue? They cannot answer. This is Socrates, the man who would change the course of human history by simply refusing to stop asking. Why? The unlikely hero. Born in 470 BC in Alapis, Athens, Socrates did not start as a philosopher. He was a stonecutter by trade, following in his father's footsteps. However, history remembers him not for what he built with his hands, but for what he dismantled with his mind. He served as a hoplite, a heavy infantry soldier, in the Peloponnesian War, where he famously survived the brutal winter of Potidaea, standing barefoot in the snow for hours, lost in deep thought. His comrades were terrified of his ability to detach from physical pain, a hint that his mind existed on a plane most men couldn't comprehend. The divine mission. The turning point of his life was the Oracle of Delphi. His friend Chaerephon asked the oracle if any man was wiser than Socrates. The answer was a flat no. When Socrates heard this, he was baffled. He knew he was ignorant. He decided to find someone wiser than himself to prove the oracle wrong. He went to the politicians, the poets, and the craftsmen. He discovered that the politicians claimed to know things they didn't, the poets spoke divinely but couldn't explain their work, and the craftsmen knew their trade but believed they were experts in everything else. Socrates realized he was indeed the wisest man in Athens, but only for one reason: he was the only man who knew that he knew nothing. The gadfly and the state. Socrates became a gadfly, a stinging insect attached to a sluggish horse, Athens, meant to sting the state into action and awareness. He didn't lecture, he interrogated. This method, now known as the Socratic method, forced his interlocutors to examine their own beliefs until they reached a state of aporia, or intellectual deadlock. He didn't just annoy people, he threatened the bedrock of Athenian society. In a world of dogmatic tradition, Socrates insisted on radical, rational questioning. He taught that the unexamined life is not worth living. He moved through the streets, challenging the youth to prioritize the health of their souls over money and reputation. The trial of the century. By 399 BC, the power brokers of Athens had had enough. The city was recovering from a disastrous war, and they needed a scapegoat. Socrates was dragged into court on two ridiculous charges: corrupting the youth and impiety, introducing new gods. The trial was a masterclass in defiance. When asked to propose his own punishment, most would have begged for mercy. Socrates instead suggested he be given free meals in the Prytaneum, an honor reserved for Olympic heroes. He essentially told the jury that instead of being punished, he should be rewarded for his service to the city's intellectual life. It was a suicide note written in arrogance and truth. He was sentenced to death. The final drink. In his final days, his followers, including a grieving Plato, offered him a chance to escape. He refused. He argued that the laws of Athens had nurtured him his entire life, and to break them now to save his skin would be a betrayal of his own principles. On the day of his execution, he stood in his prison cell, surrounded by friends who were sobbing. He remained completely calm, discussing the immortality of the soul as if he were discussing the weather. He took the cup of hemlock poison, drank it steadily, and walked until his legs grew heavy, then lay down to die. His last words were a request to pay a debt for a rooster, a final act of politeness that remains one of the most enigmatic exit lines in history. Why he still haunts us. Socrates wrote nothing down. Not a single word. Everything we know of him comes from the filtered memories of his students, primarily Plato. This makes Socrates the greatest mystery in philosophy, a ghost who haunts every university, every courtroom, and every scientific lab in the world today. He taught us that truth is more important than comfort. He showed that the most dangerous weapon in history is not a sword, but a question. He proved that even if they take your life, they cannot touch your integrity. As we look at the world today, flooded with misinformation and noise, Socrates stands as a silent, barefoot giant. He reminds us that the quest for wisdom is not a destination, but a relentless, dangerous, and beautiful journey, a journey that starts the moment you have the courage to say, "I do not know." After learning how Socrates chose death over compromising his principles, do you believe that such a rigid commitment to truth is possible, or even desirable, in our modern, fast-paced world? Here are the subsequent chapters of Socrates' extraordinary life, continuing the narrative of his mysterious and transformative journey. The daimonion, the voice within. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Socrates' life was his claim of possessing a daimonion, a divine, internal voice that spoke to him from childhood. This was not a voice that told him what to do, but rather a prohibitive force that warned him whenever he was about to make a mistake. He never used this to gain political power. In fact, it kept him away from the corrupt machinery of Athenian politics. To this day, philosophers and psychologists argue over whether this was a genuine mystical experience, a form of acute intuition, or the manifestation of his own highly refined moral compass. The marriage of fire and ice, Xantippe. Socrates' domestic life was a study in profound contradiction. His wife, Xantippe, is often portrayed as a sharp-tongued, temperamental woman who could not fathom why her husband spent his days begging for knowledge in the marketplace instead of earning a living. Legend has it that after an intense verbal lashing from her one afternoon, Socrates simply walked out of the house. As he did, she dumped a bucket of dirty water over his head. Socrates, drenched and standing in the street, calmly wiped his face and remarked to his friends, "After the thunder, the rain must surely follow." He claimed that living with Xantippe was the ultimate exercise in patience, the perfect training for a man who had to remain calm while debating the most stubborn minds in Greece. The weapon of ignorance, the elenkos. Socrates' philosophy was not found in dusty scrolls but in the heat of conversation. He perfected a method known as the elenkos, or Socratic method. He never claimed to have the answers. Instead, he acted as a midwife of ideas, helping others give birth to their own truths. If someone claimed to know the definition of justice, Socrates would interrogate them until their own logic collapsed, leaving them in a state of aporia, a bewildered state of intellectual paralysis. By proving that the most learned men in Athens knew nothing, he became the most dangerous man in the city. He didn't just win arguments, he dismantled the arrogance of the elite. The superhuman Stoic. Socrates' ability to detach from the physical world was, to his contemporaries, downright eerie. During the brutal winter campaigns of the Peloponnesian War, soldiers were wrapped in heavy furs and struggling to stay warm. Yet, there was Socrates, standing in the freezing snow wearing only his standard tunic, barefoot, lost in deep meditation for hours on end. He felt no cold, no hunger, and no fear. He viewed the body as a prison for the soul, and he had learned how to unlock the door at will. This detachment is exactly why, when the moment of his execution arrived, he greeted his own death not with fear, but with the casual grace of a man setting off on a long-awaited journey. The legacy of silence. The most shocking truth about the most famous philosopher in history is that he wrote nothing. He believed that written words were dead, that they couldn't answer back when questioned, and that they gave the illusion of wisdom without the reality of it. Because he refused to write, his entire existence hangs on the razor's edge of his students' memories. Without the writings of Plato and Xenophon, the man who shaped the foundation of Western thought would have vanished into the mists of time, leaving behind not a single trace. He didn't build a monument of stone. He built a monument of questioning that remains standing over 2,400 years later. Socrates' life was a radical experiment in human integrity. He proved that even in a world obsessed with status, the most powerful thing a person can do is admit they know nothing and keep asking why. Having seen how he navigated his personal and public life, do you find his absolute commitment to his inner daimonion, and his refusal to leave a written record to be an act of supreme wisdom, or a missed opportunity for the world? The Great Disruption, why Athens truly feared him. To understand why Athens, a city that prided itself on being the cradle of democracy, eventually chose to silence its greatest thinker, you have to look at the atmosphere of the time. Socrates wasn't just a man asking questions, he was a systematic threat to the Athenian social order. In ancient Athens, the elite held power because of tradition, lineage, and rhetoric. The wealthy, sophists, charged young men high fees to teach them how to manipulate arguments to gain political power. Then came Socrates. He charged nothing. He asked no fees. He stood in the market, effectively hacking the system by stripping away the fancy rhetoric and exposing the lack of actual substance behind the powerful. He didn't just target the politicians. He challenged the very foundation of Athenian religion. When he suggested that his daimonion provided moral guidance superior to the traditional gods, he was, in the eyes of the city's leaders, creating a new set of deities. He was accused of corrupting the youth, which in reality meant he was teaching the sons of the wealthy to think for themselves and to question their father's authority. He had effectively created a generation of youth who were no longer willing to blindly follow the establishment. The trial, a calculated performance. The trial of 399 BC was never intended to be a fair hearing. It was a political maneuver. The prosecution expected Socrates to grovel, to apologize, and to promise to go into exile. If he had done that, the city would have let him go, and he would have been forgotten as just another eccentric old man. Instead, Socrates turned his trial into his final, grand performance. When he stood before the 500-man jury, he didn't mount a defense of his life. He mounted a defense of the truth. He treated the jury not as judges, but as a classroom. He lectured them on the importance of the soul over the body. When the verdict came in, guilty, he was given the chance to suggest a counter-penalty. This was his moment to beg. Instead, he insulted them by suggesting he deserved a lifetime of free state-sponsored meals for his contributions to the city's intellectual awakening. He essentially dared them to kill him. And by doing so, he forced them to become the villains in his story. The final hours, the art of dying. The final chapter of his life, immortalized in Plato's Phaedo, is perhaps the most surreal moment in history. While his friends were frantically planning an escape route to get him out of the city, Socrates was calmly discussing the nature of the afterlife. He viewed death not as an end, but as a release, the final separation of the soul from the distractions of the body. When the executioner brought the hemlock, the man actually wept. He was the one who had to kill the most famous man in the city. He apologized to Socrates for his role in the execution. Socrates, in his final act of compassion, comforted the executioner. He drank the poison without a tremor. As the paralysis crept up his legs, he didn't scream or struggle. He lay down, covered his face, and remained silent until the very end. The last words he uttered, "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Please pay the debt, do not forget," remain a riddle. Asclepius was the god of healing. By asking to offer a sacrifice to the god of health, Socrates was essentially saying that death was the final cure for the sickness of life. The aftermath. The birth of a legend. The execution was a catastrophic miscalculation by the Athenian state. By killing him, they didn't silence his questions, they canonized them. They turned a man into a martyr and a philosopher into a myth. Within years, the citizens of Athens allegedly regretted their decision. They realized they had murdered their own conscience. But it was too late. The Socratic spark had already jumped to Plato, and from Plato to Aristotle, and through them, it ignited the entire intellectual framework of Western civilization. Socrates proved that you can kill the messenger, but you cannot kill the message. He left behind no books, no laws, and no buildings. He left behind a method of thinking that forces every single person in every generation to sit down and ask, "What do I actually know, and why do I believe it?" Now that you know the full scope of his life, from the barefoot wanderer to the martyr of the hemlock, does Socrates seem more like a man who found the ultimate truth, or a man who was simply trapped in his own intellectual obsession? The aftershocks, the world Socrates left behind. If the death of Socrates was the end of his physical life, it was only the true beginning of his impact on humanity. To understand the shockwaves he left behind, we have to look at the vacuum he created, and who rushed in to fill it. The Socratic problem: did he even exist? The most haunting reality about Socrates is that he exists in a state of historical suspension. Because he refused to write, he is the ultimate ghost in the machine. We see him through three main lenses: Plato, who idolized him and turned him into a saintly protagonist; Xenophon, who remembered him as a practical, somewhat ordinary moral teacher; Aristophanes, the playwright, who mocked him as a dangerous, head-in-the-clouds charlatan. These perspectives are so different that modern scholars struggle to find the real man. Was he a humble seeker or an arrogant intellectual snob? The truth is, Socrates exists in the gaps between these stories. He is whatever the listener needs him to be, a mirror for our own intellectual insecurities. The school of Socrates. When Socrates died, his followers didn't just go home, they shattered into competing schools of thought, each claiming to be the true heir to his philosophy. This is the most fascinating part of his legacy. He started a civil war of ideas that lasted for centuries. The Cynics, led by Antisthenes and the wild, street-dwelling Diogenes, they took Socrates' poverty and detachment to the extreme. They argued that if Socrates was right about the soul, then society, laws, and clothing were all useless lies. They lived in barrels and barked at passers-by to mock their pretenses. The Cyrenaics, they took the opposite route. They argued that if the soul is trapped in the body, we should seek the most intense physical pleasure possible. But always with the Socratic self-control to never let pleasure master us.